Hello everybody, and thank you for joining this Farm Advisory Service webinar on employing people. Specifically, this one is looking at who should be employed and how to employ them. The main things we're going to look at today are split into two sections. So what we're first of all going to look at is when is a contractor a contractor? And that is about how we distinguish between self-employed contractors and employees. And that is very much something that's in the news at the moment, but we'll come to that in more detail and why that is important just shortly. And following that, once we've identified who needs to go through the books, then we'll look at the 6 steps to employing people. It's a flowchart process in what you would need to follow to get somebody onto the books for the first time. But it's also still relevant for those people that maybe are currently employing people. It's also a good checklist to make sure, have I got everything in place that I would need to have in place? So that's the two main sections we're going to cover for today. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour due to end at 1 p.m, but there is time within that 1 hour in order for you to be able to ask questions at the end as well, if anybody would like to keep their questions until the end. But without further ado, we'll move on to look at employees versus self-employed contractors. So, do you employ a contractor? And are they really a contractor, or would HMRC consider them an employee? Is a question I'd like you to think about today. So issues are arising where HMRC are starting to carry out employment status reviews with the many self-employed contractors that are working on farms up and down the country. And there are a number of instances where the working relationship with these self-employed contractors actually ticks all of the boxes of an employee. And if HMRC do come across one of these situations, then and consider that person an employee and should have been going through the books, there is a bill that the farmer would be hit with for tax and national insurance considered unpaid by HMRC, and potentially also with penalties. So it could be a case of that they consider it a late payment and you get hit with a penalty on top of the quantity of unpaid tax and national insurance. So that is the reason why getting to know how you can keep your working relationship with self-employed contractors, purely that, and not allow the lines between self-employed contractors and employees to become blurred, is of such high importance at the moment. And we know of some farmers that have unfortunately been caught out in this area, and it is 4-figure sum bills that we're talking about here. So it is a very important matter, and that is why we're going to start with that today. So what we're going to do is there's 5 key areas that you can assess regarding your worker's situation. So what we're going to do is a little activity is we're going to work through scenarios of 4 farm workers, and each scenario will come up on your screen. I will then take a short pause for you to have a read through the scenario and have a think about whether you would consider that person a self-employed contractor or an employee. And what I will then do after the short pause to allow you to read and think about your answer, I'll then flick on to the answer and we'll discuss through why that answer is as it is. And this is the point which I will unmute everybody, and therefore, and as we go, as each scenario completes, if anybody has a question or something they would like to share, then please come in at that point. It might be easier to deal with questions per scenario rather than try and deal with them all at the end. But like I said before, if you're not looking to ask questions or you are in a particularly noisy environment, if you could toggle yourself back onto mute using the grey panel to the left of the rectangular box on your webinar panel. So that's in the grey column to the left is the second box from the top. From there you should hopefully be able to toggle between mute and unmute. But at the moment, that should hopefully give you now the option to unmute yourself if you do require, but if not, do remember you can either type your question into the boxes on the webinar panel or you can raise your hand also, and I should get a notification regarding that. So what we'll do for just now is our first scenario. Okay, so I'll give you a moment to read through this scenario. Okay, and if you can all have a think about whether it's a self-employed contractor or an employee, keep a hold of your answers in your heads, and we'll move on to the answer. So Bill is an employee, and there was two key factors about Bill's situation that made him an employee. And the first one is he does not take his own equipment. So if we look back to Bill's scenario there, so he's general farm work, cultivating and carting grain, but he doesn't take in his own equipment. He's using the equipment that's on farm. And equipment is one of the key areas where you can distinguish between a self-employed contractor and an employee. And the view taken by HMRC is that a self-employed contractor would generally provide all of the major pieces of equipment in order to do their job. Whereas in the employee scenario, it's more likely they're bringing small bits and bobs, more that they may wish to bring those because they've got something in particular at home that's going to help them do their job. But really, as an employee, as per the wages board, should have their wellies and waterproofs provided, everything like that. So it's much more an employee that would use the equipment on farm, whereas a self-employed contractor, as much as possible, should be bringing the mobile pieces of equipment with them. There are certain jobs, and we'll come to them in our later scenarios, where it's not always possible for equipment to be provided. Equipment is often in a fixed state, and therefore that wouldn't apply in that scenario. But where their equipment is mobile, so for example, in the situation of Bill's tractor and trailer for his grain carting, if somebody was operating as a self-employed contractor, it would be expected that they were bringing that equipment with them. The other aspect of Bill's scenario is obligation. So Bill is obliged to turn up 3 days per week. So he works on Green Farm 3 days a week. He is contracted to work 3 days a week, so therefore Bill needs to be there 3 days a week, and the farmer needs to find work for Bill for those 3 days a week. So even although a lot of his jobs are, weather dependent, harvest time types of jobs, even if the weather's dreadful, he'll need to be found some wee maintenance jobs or something to keep him busy on those 3 days a week because he is contracted to be there 3 days a week. Whereas that mutual obligation does not exist with self-employed contractors. When operating with self-employed contractors, they could turn around and say they weren't coming next week because they had work elsewhere or they were busy. And likewise, the farmer could say, please don't come next week because I've got enough cover, or, we're getting into a quiet spell, not going to need you next week, so feel free to go and find work elsewhere. So there's not that same mutual obligation. So the two key factors about Bill's scenario were equipment and obligation, and they will again be covered later in some other scenarios, and we'll summarise all the key factors at the end. But for now, we'll take a look at our second scenario, which is Janice. So I'll give you a moment to read through. Okay, hopefully we've all got an answer for Janice. Janice is a self-employed contractor. And the main reason with Janice is that she is responsible for raising the invoices for her work. So Janice is entirely in control of initiating payment for her work. So if an employee situation, an employee would likely to be paid on fixed intervals, and there would be a good bit more control coming in from the employer there. They'd be running the payroll on the Friday of the last week of the month, for example. Whereas Janice, she could be paid every fortnight if she was on top with her invoices, or if she fell behind or she wasn't that good at keeping on top of her invoices, she could be paid every 6 weeks, because it's entirely up to her to raise those invoices, and no payment would ever be given until those invoices were raised. So that's the factor of payment that comes into effect with Janice. And secondly, it looks at that obligation again. So if we go back to Janice's scenario, she can have a weekend off when she chooses. She's in control of saying, I'm not coming at the weekend because, I've got work elsewhere or I've got plans, or I fancy a long lie instead of getting up at 4:30. Those sort of things. She is in control. There's not that mutual obligation to turn up every weekend, and there's not the obligation from the farmer's side to ensure that she's given the milking shifts every weekend. So the key factors in Janice's scenario are payment and obligation. So we'll just move on to look at our third scenario, who is Tom. So I'll give you a chance to think about Tom. Okay, so we'll take a look at the answer for Tom now. So Tom is an employee, and the two factors that come into Tom's scenario are obligation and control. So I'm going to flick back to his scenario to have a look through this. So Tom is working daily on South Farm, and he's feeding cattle morning and night. So he's expected to be there every day at cattle feeding time in the morning and cattle feeding time at the night. He is obliged to be there at those times. He uses the equipment that is on the farm, so that again brings us back to what we looked at with Bill's scenario, which was equipment. Are they bringing it with them, mobile pieces such as tractor, feeder wagon, or is it being used on the farm? Second part of Tom's scenario was that the farmer discusses the jobs with him every morning before he starts, and this was to highlight the aspect of control. So HMRC take, in terms of control, they take the view that a self-employed contractor tends to be able to decide when and how they do a task. Now, when is an interesting one, because if we think back to Janice in our relief milker situation, she's obviously not able to decide when she does the job, but it's likely the time, she would know what time milking started, she'd come in and she'd more than likely be left to it. A wee chat about any particular things that needed done that day or any cows to watch out for, and then, she'd be left to it. Whereas the HMRC take the view that an employee is more likely to be closely supervised and given instructions by the employer. So they're more likely to be moved between tasks where maybe an issue arises, whereas it's likely that self-employed contractors are brought in for a particular task or a particular skill that they provide and are therefore just left to do that, given some, a basic chat, let them know where the fields are, etc., if they're coming in for ploughing and their first time on the farm. But other than that, they're going to be left to it. Whereas it's more likely that an employee is in regular communications with an employer and moved between jobs here and there, as the farmer has control over them as a worker. There's obviously grey areas in every situation, and you could have an employee that has been very long serving and therefore maybe knows your system inside out, knows how you like things done, and therefore there's maybe a bit more of leaving them to it and to get on with it. But it's just making you aware that that is one of the 5 factors that HMRC would try and get an idea of in initial discussions in an employment status review, was if there was a need to exert control, what control would you have, is a good way to think about it. So to finish our scenario exercise then, we're going to have a look at Mark. So I'll give you a chance to read through Mark. So I'm hoping we're finishing on an easier one this time and you've all got your answers to Mark. Mark is a self-employed contractor. And there's 2 main reasons bring us back to equipment and obligation. So he's taken his own dog and his bike, he's providing his own equipment. He's taken all the major pieces of equipment he needs to complete his job. And obligation. Mark could choose to do a lambing elsewhere if he wished. There's no obligation for him to go to Glen Farm 3 weeks every year. It just so happens he quite likes it there. He has been going quite frequently, but it shows that there's not a mutual obligation and that the farm owners are calling Mark in the November to find out if he's going to be going that following spring. And at that November phone call point, there would be nothing to stop Mark saying, I'm not coming this year, I'm going to help out a friend, or I'm going somewhere different instead. He doesn't have that obligation that an employee would have. Okay, so just to summarise those 5 factors all together. So I put them in this order, particularly just so the first letter of each word spell copes, if that helps anybody to remember what the 5 key areas are. So control, we've just recently discussed with Tom, is it instructions and close supervision of an employee? Does the farmer have control over them as a worker? Or is it more being brought in for a specific task and skill and being left to get on with it? Obligation, are they contracted for so many days a week and come rain, sunshine or snow, you need to find work for them on those days? Or is it more, there's no mutual obligation and you can dip in and dip out of using the self-employed contractor services when the situations arise? Payment, are they being paid at fixed intervals, maybe weekly or monthly, in the form of an employee? Or are your self-employed contractors entirely responsible for raising the invoices for their work in order to initiate payment? Equipment, are they using most mobile pieces of equipment where they can? So the major pieces of equipment. So Janice is obviously the one where there's limited equipment that Janice can take with her as a relief milker, as obviously, the parlour is a fixed piece of equipment. But in Janice's situation, you'd be expecting her to bring her wheelies and her waterproofs and all the things like that, because she's not an employee, so those wouldn't be provided for her. So she is, in a way, still bringing equipment as much as she can, as much as her job allows. Substitution is the fifth area, and that is an area that my scenarios didn't cover, purely as it's probably the most unusual one to get your head round. So it's worth noting at this point that employment status reviews are also being carried out in the construction industry, and this is a factor that is probably more likely to apply in the construction industry. But the view that HMRC take is that a self-employed person can generally send a suitably qualified individual in their place, whereas an employee will have to do the work personally. So there's lots of questions to be raised about a self-employed person sending along a suitably qualified replacement. It would obviously have to be in agreement with the farmer, and not all self-employed contractors may have a replacement that they can send. They may purely work themselves. But I suppose the way to deal with this scenario is to think about what if. So if we think back to Janice, a relief milker, what if Janice couldn't do the Sunday morning she was meant to be doing, and she works quite closely with Patricia, another relief milker? Is there anything to stop Janice calling the farmer and saying, look, something's come up really short notice, I can't do Sunday morning, but Patricia is free if you're needing cover and you would be happy to accept Patricia? But it's obviously so situation dependent onto whether you may not know that person, you may not wish to accept them. But I suppose it's asking that what if situation. Are they an employee where it's them or nobody, or are they a self-employed contractor where they technically could call and offer a replacement, and then you could decide whether or not you wanted to take that replacement? But it is the more unusual situation, but it's worth noting that it would be something that would be included in the employment status review. If anybody's got any questions about the ways to distinguish between employees and self-employed contractors, or any of those factors and scenarios we've looked at there just now, then by all means please ask at this stage. But like I said, there will also be time for questions at the end if anybody would prefer, but we'll just take a short pause at the moment if anybody would like to either unmute themselves to ask a question, raise a hand, or type a questions in the question box. Okay, well, we'll just keep moving on then. So the next area we're going to look at is the 6 key steps to employing people. So this is the flowchart process that I spoke about right back at the start, about what you would need to go through in order to put somebody on your payroll for the first time, or also it can be used as a checklist for those that maybe are currently employing but want to check they have got everything in order. So without further ado, we'll move on to step 1. So step 1 would be to check that your potential employee has a right to work in the UK. So this is a factor that's quite possibly likely to become more important following the end of the Brexit transition period at the end of the year, as then there's a higher chance there could be people remaining in the UK and working illegally. So there's 2 ways that you can do a check, either the original documents or online, and we'll look more at that shortly. But it's worth noting that if you do not carry out these checks and you are caught employing illegally, it is a very nasty civil penalty that you would be hit with. So obviously there'll be situations and industries where this maybe isn't relevant because you're always employing local people friends maybe as your labour, which is fine. But in the situations where there is ever any doubt, I highly recommend that you do these checks. It's a simple process. So if we take first at checking the original documents, there's a 3-step process when checking the original documents, and it's obtain, check, copy. So you would look to obtain the originals of the document, and it's very important that they are the originals. So when you're looking to employ somebody, let's say they're coming for an interview or a look around the farm, the idea would be, if you could, to get them to bring some documents with them at that point, and you could check them there when they were with you. As the very important part of check is that you check with the employee present. The acceptable documents that you can check vary depending on what right somebody has to work in the UK, so whether they're currently sitting with a permanent right or a temporary right. And their sub-lists then go down to how long that temporary right lasts for. There are obviously some standard documents that you would expect, but the best place to go to is the right to work checklist. And that is one of the web links that is on the Farm Advisory Service website. So I'm sure many of you may already have gone on that. But if not, it's simply www.fas.scot. And when the home page comes up, there's a blue toolbar along the top. And on that toolbar, you would look to click Rural Business. And at that point, various boxes would appear, and one box would be employing people. And if you click on that, there's various subsections. One of them is right to work and EU nationals, I think is maybe the term used. So click on that, and in there you'd get various web links, one of which would be a right to work checklist and also an employer's guide for carrying out these checks. When you're doing the check, it's obviously the obvious things that you're looking to check the documents are genuine and the date of birth across all documents matches to prove that the person really is who they say they are, and obviously that the photo matches the person you're looking to employ. Once you have checked these documents, you then need to take a copy of them. So the copy can be either electronic or a paper copy, but as long as you take some form of a copy and retain those copies in the file so that you can always prove that you carried out a right to work check. On those copy documents, you would look to write that the check was conducted on what date it was conducted. At that point, if both yourself as the employer and the potential employee could sign that document, then that would show that the check had been carried out when the employee was present. So that is the way to check the original document. So that's option 1. But if you're about to employ somebody who has a right to work share code, then you can do the check online. So an online right to work share code simply involves going onto the gov.uk website, and the link to that is another one on the Farm Advisory Service website. And if your potential employee had a right to work share code, then all they would need to give you was that share code and their date of birth, and you could go online and do the check. So the check screen would come up looking like this. It would show you a picture of the person so that you could check it was the person you thought you were going to employ, show you their name and when they had a right to work until. So for example, Lee Jones can work until the 30th of April 2020 in the UK. And then there's a small area down the bottom which allows you to view a PDF of this page, which you could then save or print as your evidence that you had carried out the check. So it's a one or the other situation. You don't need to do both, but it will only be people who have a right to work share code where you can do the online check. So in that case, if they didn't have that, you would look to go back and do an original document check. Before we go any further, I'm just going to add in here a slide about what changes Brexit has brought for EU workers. So there obviously have been many changes, but it's worth noting if anybody has EU, EEA or Swiss citizens working with them, then they can apply to the EU settlement scheme to live permanently in the UK. So those applications are open and can go in now, but all applications must be in by the 30th of June 2021. And to be eligible, they must have been resident in the UK by December 2020. So they can't come to the UK after December 2020 and apply to the EU settlement scheme. The status and rights granted will depend on how long they've been living in the UK at the point that they apply. So if they've been in the UK for a continuous 5-year period, at the point they apply, they'll be given settled status, whereas otherwise they'll be given a pre-settled status, which can be upgraded at a later date. But again, there's a lot more information and links on the Farm Advisory Service Employing People page on the website. It will give you links to the form and other guidance notes and more information. It's worth noting, as employers, there's no obligation for you to flag this scheme up with your workers, but there will be many farms and many businesses where EU nationals are a huge part of the workforce and have been for many years and would be members of staff that they would look to retain. So it is worth maybe making sure they know the scheme is open for applications to ensure that you can retain these members of your teams. So step 2 then is to register as an employer with HMRC. This is something that can be done in advance of the first time you pay new staff. So you can do it up to 2 months in advance, but it's worth noting it can take 5 to 10 days to get your PYE reference number as they come through the post. So don't leave it too late until you need to do your first payroll. Try and get ahead of the game a little bit. The good point worth noting about this one is you can use an existing government gateway account. So many farm and businesses will have government gateway accounts that would previously have been used for VAT. So those can still be used. You simply log in at the same page with the same login details, and you can go to the employers or PYE section, and there you can register as an employer and enrol for PYE online if you wish to do that as well. But if you don't have a government gateway account or you have any issues using that method, then there's a very simple, one side of A4 form that can be completed, giving basic information about your business, such as, your trading name, how many people you're looking to maybe employ, and you can submit that, and that'll just the same way get your PYE reference numbers sent in the post. And that the link to that form is also one of the web links on the Employing People website page as well, if anybody is requiring that. So step 3 then, and also I should have said there is a practical guide section on that website, and one of the practical guides is how to register as an employer with HMRC, so there's much more detailed information on that as well. So step 3 then is employer's liability insurance. So this must be put in place as soon as you become an employer, and it must cover at least £5 million for compensation for injury and illness related to the work they carry out for you. This applies even if it's a family friend or a neighbour that is your labour. Any form of labour, you require employer's liability insurance, employed labour. Also, there's conflicting reports in relation to what happens if you are a fully family member labour. So some professions would say absolutely have it regardless. If you've got family labour, make sure you've got employer's liability insurance. Some are saying if it's only if your farming business is a limited company that you would require employer's liability insurance. So say you were a father-son partnership business, then it wouldn't be required. So what I would say is to check with a professional that you work with as part of your business what they would advise. But it is worth noting it's a £2,500 fine per day if this insurance is not in place when it should be. So it is worth something that's worth looking into if you've not already got in place. Another point to note is that the Health and Safety Executive take the view that your employees should know you have this insurance in place, and therefore your insurance certificate should be displayed somewhere on the farm so that they know that. And if you were to be inspected and you didn't have that insurance certificate in place, then it would be another fine. So that's just something else worth noting. Step 4 then is to check the minimum wage that employees are due. So in agriculture, minimum wage is set by the Scottish Agricultural Wages Board. The change date for all rules from the Wages Board is the 1st of April. So these minimum wages that are on the screen at the moment are the current ones and will last up until the end of this month. There is a very good guidance book called Agricultural Wages in Scotland, a guide for workers and employers that the Wages Board produce, and it's a fantastic reference guide for all matters, not just relating to minimum wage, but also holiday entitlement, sick pay, such things like this. It really is a very good guide. There is, again, one of the web links on the web page is to an electronic copy of it. and that web link will update to the copy of the new book, which will be effective from the 1st of April 2020 in due course once that's available. But to have a look at minimum wages for the moment, it's £8.21 per hour as a minimum for all people. You then have the option, if your workers have qualifications in agriculture or horticulture at level 6 or 7 SCQF or above. So that's sort of everything from modern apprenticeships to national certificates up to diplomas and upwards. So that's SCQF 6/7 or above. Then they are entitled to a £1.25 per hour top up. So that would take their minimum wage at the moment up to £9.46 per hour. There is one exemption to the £8.21 per hour minimum, which is modern apprentices who can be paid £5.30 per hour for up to 18 months. But that would be modern apprentices that are going through an official recognised scheme. Minimum wages are due to go up as of the 1st of April 2020, so that is why I recommend you consult the Wages Board guide, the new guide, once it is released. Step 5 that was me also saying, there's a video summarising all of the rules and regulations around wages and benefits that is available on the Farm Advisory Service website. So that will look at wages and overtime, how to factor in houses, holiday entitlement, sick pay and dismissal. So if anybody's got any queries regarding that, then that is a good reference document that you can go back and refer to at any time. And like I said, there's also that guide from the Scottish Agricultural Wages Board. Just one other note about some changes coming on the 1st of April 2020. I've obviously mentioned minimum wage set to go up, but the calculation that is used for holiday entitlements for workers who work varying number of days per week is changing. So this only applies to workers who, say for example, are in a situation where they work 1 day a week 1 week, the next week they could be in 5, the week following they could be in 3. They're employees of you, but they don't have a set working pattern. If you have workers like that, then at the moment you calculate their holiday entitlement by the average number of days they work over a 12-week period. However, that is now changing to cover a 52-week period. And the reason for that is that general employment law is changing to make the period a 52-week period. So therefore, the Wages Board and Agriculture will be changing to ensure they comply with general employment law. Again, it's an area that we hope to get further guidance on following the release of the new Wages Board guide. So that's why I can't recommend enough that you do go and investigate that web link to the electronic copy of the Wages Board guide, which will automatically update once the new guidance book comes out, and more information there can be found on the changes that are coming as of the 1st of April 2020. So step 6 then is to get a written statement of employment in place for all workers. This should be in place ideally when workers start, but you do have up to 2 months from when they start working with you to get this in place. There's a very good template which the Wages Board have produced, and I have included that again on the materials on the Farm Advisory Service website. But it gives you a very good idea of what sort of factors should be included in a contract of employment. So obviously it's their rate of pay, the hours they're expected to work, what their holiday entitlement is, what notice period they would be required to give, and what notice period they're entitled to receive. It is very good for both the sake of yourselves as employers and employees to get an employment contract down in writing, and it then purely states what the expectations of the employee are and also what they can expect from you as an employer. And it means that you've got evidence in writing should anything ever go wrong or there be any queries further down the line with your employment. The sooner you get this in place, the better. When you go, the web link to the contract from the Wages Board does take you to a Word document that you could then print or type into. So it's a very good document to use if you don't currently have one of these in place but are needing to get one in place. Then it is a very good place to go. It's worth noting that of if you make a change to an employment contract. So if you've got an employment contract in place and then something needs changed about it, that change must be recorded in writing. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a new contract, it could just be a statement of amendment, stapled onto the back of the current contract and showing the date that it was amended on, and a signature by both yourself and the employee to show that any amendment to a contract had only happened with the agreement of both parties. So just everything should really be in writing when it comes to contracts of employment and statements of employment. So the final step to employ somebody then is step 6, auto-enrol eligible employees on a pension scheme. So pensions changed. For most small businesses, it probably didn't come into effect until 2018. But it's no longer the choice of an employee to be included on a pension scheme and to save. It's now the duty of an employer to enrol them on a pension scheme and make a contribution. So those people that are eligible under auto-enrolment are those aged between 22 and the state pension age and earn at least £10,000 a year before tax. So they have to meet both those criteria in order to be eligible for auto-enrolment. And auto-enrolment works by, firstly, choosing a pension scheme. For many people, particularly if you're using payroll software where your pension schemes is linked in, it's probably Nest Pensions that most farming businesses would certainly go for, and it's one that was set up for workplace auto-enrolment, and it does have many good features. Following selection of your pension scheme and identification of who needs auto-enrolled, you need to write to staff to inform them that you're going to be auto-enrolling them on a pension scheme. At the point that you have written to staff, they then have a 1-month opt-out period. So although your duty is to auto-enrol them, they don't have to remain in the scheme. So they can notify you that they wish to opt out. If they opt out within that 1-month opt-out period, any contributions that happen to have gone into their pension scheme, they are entitled to back. They can opt out at a later date. Apologies, we've lost the slides. I'm just trying to go back to it now. There we go. They can opt out at a later date. However, any contributions that have been made to their pension scheme remain frozen in their pension. Once you've sorted your who's opting in, who's opting out, you then go online and declare your compliance with the pension's duties online within 5 months of starting to employ. So you've got 5 months from the date that you employ somebody in order to get all this in order. One of the web links on the Employing People webpage is to template letters that you can use if you're needing to write to staff to inform them that they're being auto-enrolled. Every 3 years, re-auto-enrolment or re-enrolment comes round. And as employers, you are required to check if there is anybody that has left your pension scheme that requires to be re-enrolled. And that includes those that chose to opt out. They do need to come back in re-enrolment. And again, when you re-enroll them, they do need to be notified by letter that they are being re-enrolled. So once you've re-enrolled anybody you then redeclare your compliance. But even if you've not got anybody to re-enroll, you do need to go online and redeclare your compliance. So state that no changes are needed, you're still meeting your duties, and redeclare your compliance that way. So that is the main things to note about auto-enrolment, but there is a pensions and payroll area on the Employing People webpage that will give you more information and more web links if anybody is requiring more information in relation to that. But for now, I'll just summarise with some key messages and then I'll open up for questions. So these are some take-home messages that I hope anybody could take home today, regardless of whether they're currently employing somebody and came on this webinar as a bit of a check, but also even if you're looking for the first time to take on an employee. So firstly, assess the status of your workers. Make sure that your working relationship is of an employee and they are through the books, or if it is a self-employed contractor, then make sure that those lines haven't become blurred and that you are keeping that working relationship as a self-employed contractor and are doing everything as you should be in that regard. If you have got employees, check they're being paid the correct wage. So if they do have qualifications, make sure they're getting that £1.25 an hour top up. That's often the one that most people probably forget about. Ensure written contracts are set up for all your employees. This is something that is quite often missed, and it's as much to support yourself and to back up yourself in any issues that may arise, as much as it is to let your employee know what they are entitled to. So it's in benefit of both you as an employer and the employee that you do get those put in place as soon as possible. And finally, make sure all of your eligible employees are enrolled on a pension scheme. So pensions are an ongoing process. So as employees maybe hit their 22nd birthday, if they're meeting the earnings criteria, then they need to be added to your pension scheme as part of your payroll process at that point. So it's worth just keeping a check, making sure that everybody that needs to be in the pension scheme is in it. And that is really the key summary in relation to who needs to be employed and how to employ them. So with who needs to be employed, we're looking to make sure our self-employed contractors are not actually employees. And with how to employ them, we're looking at that 6-step process flowchart that we just went through there. At this point, I will happily take any questions. I think you should be able to unmute yourself. Okay, I've got a hand up here, so let me just see if I can answer this. Okay. Okay, so Deborah, you should now be unmuted if you had a question to ask. Okay, you've typed in your question. Let me just view that. So we've got a question. I'm a small egg producer. I have 5 youngsters all working about 4 hours a week. They're all aged 15 to 16, and I have employer's liability. Okay, so you've got the employer's liability insurance. So they're youngsters, they're working maybe just, not regular hours, but roughly 4 hours a week, 15 to 16, you've got employer's liability insurance. So other things, so they'll be under the payment threshold to be worrying about tax and national insurance, which we'll be covering in webinar number 2. So probably the main thing would be, Deborah, is do they have a contract in place? To make sure they know that, if it is irregular work and it's 4 hours a week, just make sure that there's not, that they know that, and there's no expectation from them that they're going to get more regular work, because I know from speaking with the Wages Board that can be an area where issues and situations have arisen before, but they're obviously out with the area for pensions. So that's probably your, the main things covered. But if you've got, any other specific questions, then by all means come back to me. I see there's another question came in there. So yep, that's a good question there. Will this webinar be available on the website afterwards? Yes, it will be. It's been recording as we've gone through, and it will be available for you to listen back to at a later date. You should get a follow-up email. I think that will come tomorrow following this webinar, that should have a link to it, but it will also be added on to the website as well. Okay. Hopefully that answered those questions that came in there. If there's any other questions, please fire away. Okay. But like I said, there is practical guides. There's a practical guide on when as a contractor, looking at those 5 areas we looked at the start. There's one summarising those 6 key steps, and also registering as HMRC with an employer, all on the website, as well as numerous other resources. So I highly recommend you do go along to that website and view those materials. There's also the Farm Advisory Service helpline, which you can call and get free telephone advice over the phone. So up to like half an hour telephone advice that helpline entitles you to. So if you do come across any other questions or any other situations as you employ people, then you can by all means use that as well to get some information if you can't find it online. So another question there, so back to our small egg producer with our 4 youngsters, do I need to register as an employer if I'm only employing these youngsters? My initial reaction to that would be yes, as you are employing them, rather than, they're not, a contractor basis, they are being employed by you. So probably the question is, I'm wondering, are they going through payroll, or are they being paid cash? Is maybe because probably but it probably is, even if you're paying cash, especially when they're youngsters, just to back yourself up, I would say it's worth getting, some details from them and registering yourself as an employer and noting what employees. So sorry, they're paid cash, but through the books. So yes, you would need to be registered as an employer. So the main sort of things, so yep, it is worth just registering yourself as an employer, just as much as HMRC know then that you do have, employees going through the books, is the most important thing. But again, it's quite a simple process, so it shouldn't take you too long at all. Like I said, it's online, and I have put the web link on the website to take you straight there, but I would recommend you do register as an employer, yes. If there's any other questions, I'll remain on the line and keep the webinar open up and till the finishing point if anybody's got anything else they'd like to ask. But if all your questions are answered, then by all means you can exit the webinar. Just had another question in there, so I'll just read this one out. If someone is billing you as self-employed but is actually deemed as an employee by HMRC, is it the business or the individual who would be liable to the additional tax? So the business does get a bill. There obviously is and it depends on the situation in terms of exactly what has happened with the self-employed person, but because the employer's aspect of national insurance and such like hasn't been paid, HMRC do still apply a bill to the business. So it's not entirely the bill isn't entirely picked up by the self-employed contractor. I think there would be situations where they would still be hit with a bill, but the HMRC would take the view that it's a late penalty by an employer, as they should have been employed. So therefore you would still be hit with a bill. But yes, that is possibly the bit you missed. We did cover that very briefly at the start. But yes, unfortunately, there have been farming businesses hit with 4-figure sum bills in relation to this when HMRC have deemed a self-employed contractor to be wrongly categorised. So unfortunately, the business is still liable. Thank you very much for your attendance today and those questions.